Brazil is not only the major power of South America, it's also a country that many consider a serious candidate to be among the most important, influential, and prosperous nations in the world. Think about it. Brazil is the 7th largest economy on the planet, a country that has a larger population than Russia, more surface area than India, and all kinds of raw materials. In other words, it's a country that matters, or at least it should matter. And that's why all of us at VisualPolitik have been throwing around some questions. Important questions. What is Brazil's real potential? What are its great strategic advantages? And should we all be focusing our attention on the land of samba and carnival? We're going to tell you all this and more coming up. Let's get started. September 1944. In the Italian valley of the Cerrado River, Brazilian troops advance under enemy fire. Their attack breaks the German lines and marks a historic milestone. Brazil became the only Latin American nation to enter into ground combat during World War II, deploying nearly 26,000 soldiers in Europe. Its role in the liberation of Italy resulted in 20,000 prisoners, 80 cannons, 1,500 vehicles, and 4,000 horses captured. VisualPolitik community. There was a time when Brazil was a budding power looking for its place in the world. During the Cold War, however, the country fell to the back of the pack. A succession of coups d'etat and economic crises followed one after the other, completely ruining that dream. You know, yet another case of the historical Latin disease of unstable, corrupt military and populist governments. The Latin recipe for power. Nevertheless, the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the 21st century brought with it a new scenario. With a more open Brazil, the country saw poverty fall from 50% to 25%. And these days, it's still far behind the big powers. But thanks to a powerful export sector and all the black gold that now flows in torrents, they have managed to create a country where things are not all bad. In what some might consider a welfare state of a certain quality, a country with a social outlook that is not too allergic to business. A slight tendency that way, but not too much. But with a characteristic shared by the majority of states and governments that share this political philosophy, a large fiscal imbalance. This is one of the major problems facing the Brazilian economy today. We're talking about a budget deficit of almost 10% of GDP, a situation that, as you can imagine, makes the markets very nervous. The result, the Brazilian real had a terrible year in 2024. It plummeted 30% against the dollar, and the stock market is still below its 2009 levels. So of course, the data is nothing to write home about. And yet, that's not the whole story. Brazil has so many ingredients for becoming a truly prosperous country, a real power, the first power made in Latin America. So, what do you say? Will you join us on this trip to Brazil that could just be around the corner? Well, fasten your seatbelts and let's go for it. At the end of the last century, Brazil experienced an enormous agricultural boom, to the point of becoming one of the great granaries of the world. Because beyond the crises, the truth is that Brazil is not what you imagine. It's a country where, over the years, some very interesting projects have arisen. From the construction of airplanes and nuclear submarines, to global leadership in offshore oil extraction. In this video, we'll discuss many examples. For instance, before getting into the subject, we'd like to give you an example. As I have told you, Brazil is one of the world's largest agricultural producers. And what does it take to grow crops in modern agriculture? Fertilizers. Tons of fertilizers. Fertilizers that the Brazilian agricultural sector now has to import and whose price has skyrocketed in recent years. Brazil is taking a key step to reduce its dependence on imported fertilizers with projects like the Hortazes project from Brazil Potash Corp, a company already listed on the NYSE American under the symbol GRO. This project aims to produce up to 2.4 million metric tons of potash per year, which would cover about 20% of the country's demand according to data from 2021. And what's most interesting is that the Hortazes project has an estimated lifespan of 23 years, but only 5% of the deposit has been explored so far. In other words, the production potential could extend for generations. But here's where it gets really strategic. The location. The mine is close to the Amazon River system, which represents a huge logistical advantage. It's important to consider that Brazil currently imports most of its potash, a process that can take over 100 days. However, with this project, delivery time would be reduced to just 2.5 days. Additionally, producing locally is most likely to be significantly cheaper, with production and delivery costs at less than half of what it costs to import. Why are we telling you this? Because we found this project quite interesting for a country where, as you've seen, agriculture plays a crucial role. Well, in financial terms, construction permits have already been secured, and the company has raised $30 million in its IPO. However, environmental licensing is still an aspect to keep an eye rely on. The team behind this project is top tier. It is led by Mayo Schmidt, former CEO of Nutrien, the world's largest potash producer. Additionally, the advisory board includes key figures from Brazil's agricultural policy sector. Among the investors, Franco-Nevado Corporation stands out, and there is an offtake agreement with Amagi already secured. The business opportunity seems clear. Wall Street has shown great interest in potash, with over 77 hedge funds investing in this sector last year. If everything goes as planned, Brazil Potash Corp could become a key player in this growing market. And yes, this is happening in Brazil. It's a possible way to capitalize on its vast natural resources. This is one example of Brazil's enormous potential. Of course, we always recommend doing your own research, but if you found this project as interesting as we do, you can learn more about it through the link we've left in the description. This content was sponsored by Brazil Potash. For more information on compensation and additional disclosures, check out the link below or on screen. It is just one example of super interesting projects that we can find in this country. Later, we'll be talking about everything that is happening in the Brazilian agricultural sector. But now what matters to us is that following the first agricultural takeoff came another one whose consequences may be even more important for the country. I'm talking about the energy boom.
In 2006, several oil explorations found huge reserves of crude oil under gigantic layers of salt off the Brazilian coast. This oil was called pre-salt oil, and take note because it has considerable advantages. To begin with, the cost of production is moderate. We're not talking about Arabian levels, which are extracted cheaply, but even so, the pre-salt oil is generally considered quite profitable.
Production cost per barrel is below $35, while the international price is currently around $80. What's more, since it has little sulfur, it's much cheaper to refine, which makes this oil more coveted on the international market. Well, Brazil now produces about 2 million barrels more per day than it did in 2000. This represents an additional income for the country of about $60 billion per year. In fact, Brazilian crude oil is already playing in the big leagues of black gold. But pay attention, because this story does not stop here. According to the International Energy Agency, this country is likely to surpass China in oil production by 2030. And that's not all. The same agency estimates that by 2040, Brazil could produce 50% of the world's offshore oil. In fact, the Brazilian government's goal is to become nothing less than the fourth largest crude oil producer in the world, behind only the United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. If the government's plan comes to fruition, we could be talking about production of between 5 and 6 million barrels per day in a little more than a decade. And that, VisualPolitik community, is a lot, and I mean a serious amount of money. While other producers such as Mexico are in freefall, Brazil may have decades of oil renaissance ahead of it. A kind of Saudi era is getting underway. But be careful, because it's not only the quantity that's important. In this whole story, there is also one key detail that we cannot overlook. I'm referring to its location. Being relatively close to the United States gives it direct access to refineries in the Gulf of Mexico. But not only that, Brazil also has quick access to European trade routes. Routes, moreover, that are very secure. In other words, Brazil offers enormous security of supply, and that, in today's world, is absolutely crucial. In fact, Uncle Sam is already eyeing Brazil as a key future oil and petrochemical partner.
There is an increased potential for US exports of equipment and services. Brazil's 2021 to 2030 energy expansion plan forecasts that oil and gas exploration and production investments will range from $415 billion to $454 billion.
And to all this, we have to add something extra: biofuels. You see, the vast sugarcane plantations in Brazil, which is the overwhelming world leader in this crop, not only serve to sweeten coffee, but also to feed a huge bioethanol production system. The process is relatively simple. The juice is extracted from the sugarcane, fermented with yeast and carbon dioxide, and then distilled to obtain bioethanol. This compound is then blended with gasoline in various ratios, thereby reducing costs at gas stations in most parts of the world. Well, Brazil is a power in biofuels. It is surpassed only by the United States, which overtook them in 2006. But no matter, these days, Brazil produces about 5 times more biofuels than the entire European Union combined, and neither China nor India can even come close. But we aren't finished yet. Our protagonist today is the second country in the world with the largest hydroelectric power production capacity, one of the cheapest energies that exist, if not the #1 country. Although here, as we shall see, there is some nuance to be made thanks to local politicians. But what does this mean anyway? Brazil is becoming a major energy power with all that this implies. A huge flow of dollars and potentially cheap electricity for factories and data centers. In other words, for traditional industry and also for the new digital ecosystem. Of course, when we talk about power status, I'm sure many of you automatically think of military capability. And guess what? There's something to be said here too. Pay close attention because I think what follows may surprise you a lot. Brazil's armed forces are the second largest in the Americas, second only to those of the United States. But be careful, because here we aren't talking about quantity, but quality, especially if we stick to regional standards. You see, Brazil's military forces in size are on par with countries like Thailand or Indonesia, but in armament and training, they play in a different league. The Brazilians maintain some 220 German Leopard tanks, US M109 howitzers, and others of their own production, such as the second generation Brazilian Astros. And this may not seem like much to you, but for an armed forces in Latin America, it is something totally out of the ordinary. In other words, we're potentially talking about the great player in the shadows, the great Latin sheriff. What's more, Brazilian Marines train regularly with the US Marines. The country's military tradition goes back a long way. In fact, you may not know this, but between the 1970s and 1980s, this country even had a clandestine nuclear program that they completely dismantled in the 1990s, especially due to pressure from the United States. And although Brazil never actually made a bomb or even conducted a nuclear test, the knowledge gained during the program could give the country a very fast track to developing them in the future if they wanted to. Also, pay attention to this news item.
Brazil increases uranium enrichment capacity. The new cascade is part of the first phase of a joint project with the Brazilian Navy aimed at installing 10 cascades of centrifuges, eventually enabling INB to meet about 70% of enriched uranium demand.
Brazil enriching uranium? What the hell are they up to? Well, don't worry, it's not that they're relaunching a nuclear bomb program. In Brazil, they have been very crafty, and in 2006, they opened a uranium enrichment plant in Resende, Rio de Janeiro. The plant's main goal is twofold: to achieve almost total nuclear fuel independence for its nuclear reactors in the future, and also to supply fuel for its first fleet of atomic submarines. Hence, the news item talked about the project being underway in conjunction with the Navy. And beware that nuclear submarines are not a distant dream. The project is already underway, and although it uses French technology, it's being built by the Brazilians themselves.
France to help Brazil develop nuclear-powered submarines. This site in Itaguai used to be nothing but forest and swamps. It is now one of the most modern submarine construction sites in the world, and the only one in the southern hemisphere.
So yes, Brazil will soon join the club of countries with nuclear submarines, a club that today is only composed of 6 countries, and that has only 2 candidates set to join in the next few years, Australia and Brazil. Evidently, this will be a major game changer in terms of strategy and political influence. Isn't it amazing? To this milestone, we must also add another great goal scored, in this case by the Brazilian Air Force. In 2014, Brazil decided to modernize its fighters with the Swedish Saab 39 Gripen E, with an initial contract for 40 units, which would soon be extended to 30 more. Crucially, this multi-purpose fighter would not be a simple import, but the Brazilian manufacturer Embraer reached an agreement with the Swedish company Saab to manufacture them in Brazil itself. And guess what? They've become the most advanced fighter manufactured in all of Latin America.
O início da produção dos caças Gripen em terras brasileiras, mais precisamente aqui, na fábrica de Gavião Peixoto, da prestigiada Embraer, tornou-se responsável pela montagem dos caças do país e assim é a primeira fábrica de caças supersônicos da América Latina.
Put another way, Brazil has the potential to become the new Uncle Sam of the Americas. As I said before, the great sheriff of all Latin America. And take note, because now that we're talking about Embraer, this company is not exactly small. It's the 3rd largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. Its regional aircraft compete head-to-head on short-haul routes with giants such as Boeing and Airbus, and have won over airlines in more than 100 countries.
What's more, Embraer not only manufactures passenger aircraft, but also, as we said, has a military branch. Its most recent jewel is the C-390 Millennium, a tactical transport aircraft that has caught the attention of NATO, is such good value for money that it's already in the fleets of countries such as Portugal, Hungary, and the Netherlands. Even South Korea, which has one of the most advanced and largest military industries in the world, has purchased this aircraft that can operate on makeshift runways, refuel in flight, and move up to 26 tons of cargo.
In fact, many experts place the Brazilian armed forces among the 15th most powerful in the world, and they're climbing the ranks at full speed. Now, remember what we were saying a moment ago about the agricultural boom? Well, pay attention because this is also very interesting. Despite its enormous size and everything you may have heard, the truth is that Brazil has an unfriendly geography for agribusiness. Almost half of the country is covered by the Amazon rainforest, an area that, as you can imagine, is not ideal for large crops. And the rest of the territory is surrounded by Atlantic forests and other areas that are not particularly good for agriculture either. The only viable option was the Cerrado, which is the region you see highlighted on the screen. The problem is that this tropical savanna was also hostile to crops and livestock. Nevertheless, in the 1970s, the government created the Brazilian Agricultural Research Company. And from then on, a team of 1,000 researchers dedicated themselves, body and soul, to transforming the Cerrado thanks to biotechnology. The result? Brazil adopted new cropping systems that reduce soil erosion and also created special crop varieties that are perfect for growing in these soils. Give you an idea, we could even compare it to what Israel did with water, but instead of talking about water infrastructure, we're talking about land. And out of nowhere, a significant part of the 2 million square kilometers of El Cerrado suddenly became a gigantic global granary. And keep in mind, we're talking about an area that is 4 times the size of the whole of France. And now, take a look at these numbers. These days, Brazil is an agricultural power in every sense of the word. Its soybeans, for example, have gone from being insignificant to meeting 40% of global supply. The same happened with beef and sugarcane, which have increased like crazy. And although coffee has had its ups and downs, it has also gained ground. Well, this is no joke because Brazil currently accounts for 10% of world agricultural trade. And where is all this happening? In Cerrado, a territory that seemed impossible to cultivate, and is now instead a miracle of economics and biotechnology. Although truth be told, the environmentalists' movements are not amused. But that's another story. In today's case, the potential of this area has not reached its peak.
Analysis conducted for this report, based on the government's ecological transformation plan priorities, has found that the Cerrado has the potential to add around $47 to $72 billion annually to the country's GDP.
Brazil continues to step on the accelerator. Plans are underway to improve plantation genetics, pasture care, and even livestock diets. For example, it's expected that with all these changes, productivity in the Cerrado could increase from 67 to almost 160 kilos of meat per hectare in the medium term. In other words, a radical change. And that's not all either. With all these new techniques, a lot of degraded pastures could be recovered and used to produce soybeans and corn in a big way. So yes, Brazilian agro trade is set to score a lot of goals. But let's recapitulate. If we were to put on a blackboard everything we've told you so far, we'd have cereals, meat, energy, and military power, to which we would have to add a massive mining sector. Brazil is #1 worldwide in the extraction of niobium, a strategic metal used in the aerospace industry. Along with that, it's a major producer of gold, iron, precious stones, bauxite, manganese, copper, graphite, and very importantly, rare earths. It's estimated that it could possess about 1/5 of all the world's rare earth deposits. Take note of this. And these are just a few examples of a very powerful mining industry. So the question is, what more could you ask for to join the club of the world's great powers? As you can see, in theory, Brazil has it all. But naturally, if it's not in the club, it's for a reason. Of course, there are hurdles we cannot overlook.
Accounts pending.
There's none worse shot than the shoemaker's wife, an old saying that fits the subject of this video to a T. Because yes, Brazil is an energy giant in exports, but at home, things are not so solid. You see, about 60% of all Brazilian electricity comes from hydroelectric power plants, a model that made perfect sense in the 20th century. Brazil has many rivers and streams that made this development easy, and also the low production costs we spoke of are really attractive. Nevertheless, there is one problem. The country has developed its hydropower power industry a lot, but has done very little in the way of alternatives. So, what is the problem? Well, in drought years, things don't look so great. To address this situation, in 2021, the government of Jair Bolsonaro approved the construction of 14 thermoelectric power plants, a number that has continued to grow since then. The plan is simple. Compensate for the drop in hydroelectric power with thermal plants that operate in times of drought. What's more, he also privatized Eletrobras, the leading development of the thermoelectric sector, in the hands of private investment. The idea was a good one. Thermoelectric power uses fossil fuels as a base. It's easily accessible and can be turned on and off at convenience. At that time, coal was the first choice, although gas will become much more important in the coming years. Yes, Brazil is one of the countries that is embracing gas to support its electricity system, but for now, it has a problem. In 2022, the war in Ukraine triggered prices for everything that could be burned in thermoelectric plants. But not only that, due to political difficulties, the country has not developed its infrastructure well, and the regulatory blubber of the system is considerable, something that makes costs soar. This problem not only limited the potential of its relatively cheap energy, but also triggered a tug-of-war between leftist President Lula da Silva and his conservative rival Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro tried to lower costs by extending tax benefits for coal, but Lula has turned off the tap and is diverting those funds to wind-powered energy. And who has paid the bill for this fight? Well, for now, the Brazilians themselves.
Expensive energy for consumers. 25% of Brazilians' income is spent on energy. When the cost of energy goes up, so do products. Bread carries 27% of its cost in energy, meat 33.3%. The same as milk.
Not surprisingly, this problem has caused a kind of bottleneck for the country's economic growth. In fact, things have gone so dreadfully wrong that according to a study by Brazil's Association of Large Industrial Energy Consumers, energy in Brazil is almost as expensive as it is in Germany. But naturally, the level of household income is not what German households have. In energy matters, politicians have done nothing but screw up time and time again with regulations that have only made things more complicated. The good news, however, is that this could soon change. The country is investing heavily in the energy field lately, and Argentina's own development of Vaca Muerta could give Brazil huge access to nearby and relatively cheap natural gas. Watch for this in the coming years. Be that as it may, Brazil's problems do not end with its power lines, but also affect its future generations. Because yes, this country is facing a brutal educational crisis, far from what is expected of a budding power. Look at the fact that only 11% of young people are enrolled in vocational training programs, while in the OECD countries, the average is 44%. And that is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that the skills acquired during the years of study are poor. Even if we look at the richest quartile, education in Brazil still leaves much to be desired. Only 51% of the most advantaged adolescents can solve basic math problems, while in developed countries the average is close to 90%. And the same goes for reading, writing, the use of digital tools, and complex reasoning. It's a disaster. Why does this happen? Well, due to structural problems. To begin with, the Brazilian school calendar is too short, with up to 50% fewer classes than in countries like Australia or Denmark. And of course, without qualified human capital, the large investments that have come into the country have run into a problem. There aren't enough skilled workers. According to a survey by the Sao Paulo Federation of Industries, 55% of companies have difficulties in hiring qualified personnel. And as if that weren't enough, the National Industrial Apprenticeship Service estimates that in the next 4 years, there will be a deficit of almost 500,000 specialized professionals. And then there is the issue of the great political polarization. A very clear example of that was the assault on the Three Powers Square in Brasilia on 8th of January 2023, which was something like the Brazilian version of the assault on the Capitol. Well, since then, neither Lula nor Bolsonaro have lowered their tone. This has raised the risk of a major institutional deterioration in the coming years. And the problem is that nobody trusts Latin America when the waters are troubled. And in this case, it seems that the waters are troubled. As you can see, this South American giant plays a key role in major global value chains. It's a heavyweight in grains, meat, mining, and oil, and keep in mind that these are essential commodities. What's more, it's acquiring a growing military capability that positions it as the grand sheriff of the region. However, here's the paradox. It has given a lot to the world, but little to itself. With a deficient educational system, Brazilians are unable to make the leap to development. Meanwhile, the political class continues to be trapped in its internal struggle of infinite interests. VisualPolitik community, let me be clear. Brazil has a potential like few other countries in the world. If the Brazilians decided to exploit it once and for all, things could change very quickly. But for now, Brazil seems determined not to climb aboard that rocket. But at this point, it's your turn. Do you think Brazil deserves a seat in the club of global powers? When do you think this nation could make its big breakthrough? Leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. And if you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. As always, thank you so very much for watching. All the best. I'll see you next time.